Well, the author of John's Gospel, and it probably wasn't John, but that's a whole other sermon, doesn't even record her name. She was simply a woman from Samaria, an outcast, invisible, less than, not even regarded as a person or a human being. This is not the first time we have seen this type of encounter with Jesus in Scripture. Given the likely temperature, it was midday at noon, we're told, and remember, this is all in the desert. The animosity between Jews and Samaritans, they had been enemies for 400 years. And the culturally inappropriate nature of a man talking alone with a woman to whom he was not married. The Torah doesn't simply say, don't do it. It says, don't even come close. Don't even think about it. This lengthy exchange takes on the demeanor almost of a soap opera. But all the barriers to their encounter appear immaterial to Jesus, who initiates the conversation. He started it. The disciples take notice, and their shock is documented upon their return to this historic well. The woman knows this conversation is not typical. It is, in fact, extraordinary. Not only because of its content and Jesus' knowledge of her life, but because of all the reasons they should have nothing to do with each other. She lists the well-known, long-standing, insurmountable difference between them. How is it that a Jew asks me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink? Now, the writer of John wants to make sure readers know this is not allowed, adding, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. You can tell in your text, it's kind of like an editorial comment inserted in there. That word dealings is found only in this verse in all of the New Testament and can be translated as associate with, emphasizing just how much these two should not be sharing space. It would seem that Jews had a strong sense of social distance or distancing long before coronavirus came along. Now, the Samaritan woman goes on to note that her people worship on a mountain, on the mountain they're near, but Jews worship in Jerusalem. She's quite knowledgeable. Their differences are many, and they are profound. Gender, ethnicity, worship practices, and marital status, all loaded categories which conspire to prevent Jesus and this woman from being in conversation, making it an unlikely encounter, to be sure, but a great one just the same. Now, think with me for just a moment about those times in your life when you had an unlikely encounter. These encounters are usually only unlikely on the surface, on the outside. You talk to an old man on the bus and find out that he's a retired college professor who may have taught your parents. Yeah. Or when a kidney donor was found for Pastor Chung in his own congregation and she was not related to him. Or when a Jewish rabbi is sitting in the shade by a well, minding his own business, when a Samaritan woman of some repute, no less, comes to draw some water, and they find themselves engrossed in conversation. Now, I find this interesting. The word woman in this text is significant here. John uses the Greek word gunai, which is a term of great endearment. Think of it. This woman is a village outcast who must fetch water in the heat of the day to avoid contact with others. Jesus, seeing the possibilities in her, calls her gunai, dear one, sweetie. And it gets even better. She is the first person in John's Gospel, and for that matter, in the whole New Testament, to whom Jesus reveals his true identity as the Messiah, when he says to her, I am the one. I am the Messiah. Now, this encounter with Jesus changed her life. Immediately she goes and brings back many people to see Jesus, and because of her, they come to believe in him. Legend has it that she became a convert to the Christian faith and took the name Fotini, Photini, which means enlightened one, at her baptism. She became a significant figure in the Johannine community and contributed greatly to the spread of Christianity. Now, in Greek sermons from the 4th through the 14th centuries, she is called apostle and referred to as an evangelist. She is often compared to the male disciples and apostles and found to surpass them. She and her children and her sisters are reported to have been tortured by Nero, but were left unscathed by these attacks, and they were fierce attacks too. She converted Nero's daughter, much to his dismay. While she was incarcerated in a prison in Rome, she turned it into a house of worship and converted not only the prison guards, but many Roman citizens who heard of her gifts and listened to her story. I remember listening to a TED Talk several years ago. It was amazing. I listened to the wonderful writer, Chimamanda, I hope I said that right, Ngozi Adichie, talk about the danger of the single story. She was grateful, funny, insightful, and wise, all in 20 minutes of sharing experiences from her own life, as she talked about the power of stories and about the many different stories that make us who we are. Like her story about growing up in Nigeria, comfortable and middle class on a university campus where her father was a professor. Her family, like many others, had domestic help who came from a nearby village. There was a boy named Fide whose poverty moved Adichie to pity whenever her mother offered his family extra food and old clothes. That was how Adichie thought of Fide, as a poor boy. So when she visited Fide's home, she was shocked when his family showed her a beautiful patterned basket made by Fide's brother. That didn't fit into the single story she had in her head about Fide's family. She didn't think that they could do anything but be poor. And then, when she came to school in America, she was dismayed that her roommate asked her how she learned to speak English so well. English is Nigeria's official language. And when her roommate asked her to play some of her tribal music, it was her turn to be dismayed when Adichie played Mariah Carey's CD. Adichie described her roommate's default position as patronizing, well-meaning pity, because she had only one story of Africa, the one our culture tells us about beautiful landscapes and gorgeous wild animals and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak up for themselves and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. For her roommate, that single story was easy to understand, and she didn't seem to know how to encounter and engage Adichie as an equal, as someone who was like her in many, many ways, as a complex person shaped by many different stories. Of course, life is so much simpler if everyone has just a single story, right? As Adichie says, that shows them this as one thing, as only one thing. And they tell that story over and over, and then they become that thing. This is about power, of course. When somebody else decides what the story is, and therefore who you are because of it. That's where stereotypes come from, and we all know how helpful stereotypes are. Let's think for just a moment about First Presbyterian Church of Encino as a well, a drinking fountain. This church and this hour are like that well in Samaria. Here we find the Messiah waiting for us with living water, with a wondrous, inclusive, healing love. Are there any cultural, religious, or racial barriers at our well? Our church? What about our community? How does Jesus transcend those divisions? How do we? Adichie says that to engage a person properly, we must engage all the stories that have made that person who they are. I've read the story of Jesus and Fotini so many times, preached about it a number of times too. It's one of my favorites. And by far, it represents the longest conversation Jesus has with anyone in the Bible. As well as a source of water, maybe even living water, I invite you all to be mindful of water this week. And yes, rain is water, so God is helping us out here. Every time you encounter water, think about Jesus and his statement that he is the living water. What, if any, difference does this awareness make in how you go about your daily activities? Yes, you may be brushing your teeth with Jesus. Sorry about that. Is it any coincidence that people have been hoarding bottled water this past week? And we've all seen it. Why are they doing that? Do they think our faucets will run dry? Or that our water will be somehow contaminated? Or do they all want to be reminded of Jesus? Wouldn't that be wonderful? Or are we simply in a fear-based panic mode? I love that this noteworthy conversation with Jesus is with a woman. And from that conversation, she became an evangelist. And eventually, she became an apostle, and an apparently good one. When and how have you told someone about Jesus? How was it received? Fotini encountered Jesus while doing her daily tasks. She was not looking for a religious experience or even to have her life changed. Have you ever unexpectedly encountered Jesus during the ordinary, everyday parts of your life? How did you recognize him? Would that we, like Fotini, have eyes to see and the courage to tell others of Jesus' expansive, indeed inexhaustible love that saves us, sets us free, casts out fear, and makes us one human family. Friends, we have no idea what lies ahead. We don't know what tomorrow will be like. We don't know what next week will bring. We have no idea how long the pandemic will last or the toll it will take. Like I announced earlier, the session will meet Tuesday to chart our course here at Encino First Presbyterian Church as best we can. I will recommend that we continue to worship and keep up with the small Bible studies that occur weekly. Our choir can sing, do a wonderful job, and we can give ourselves as much social distancing as we need. Friends, we do not need to panic. We do not need to hoard. We do not need to blame. We need to take care of ourselves and each other. If you don't feel good, please stay home. If you don't feel safe coming to worship, then access us online. Stay in touch with each other. And pray without ceasing for a speedy end to this, and for those lives that will be so much more impacted by this then perhaps ours will be. LAUSD serves 1 million meals a day. Let me repeat that. LAUSD serves 1 million meals a day. It isn't just school. It is food and a safe place for our children to be, and they have lost that. We find ourselves in a situation that can be fast changing too. We need to be prepared to make quick decisions with short notice in order to promote the health of our community, which is the most important. So stay tuned and read your emails or follow us on Facebook. And above all else, be safe. Remember to be mindful and take extra care. I know that feelings can be profound in our current predicament, and understandably so. Still, we know that our God is great. He loves us fiercely. The love of Abba God is fierce. I leave you with this promise from Psalm 95, verses 6 and 7. Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before our Maker. For God is our Creator, and we are the people of God's pasture, the flock under the care of the Holy One. Thanks be to God. Now, in your bulletin, you have a creed. I'd like you to take out your bulletin. Is it on the screen too? Yeah. And we'll read it together in unison. I believe that our lives are held within the encircling love of God, who knows our names and recognizes our deepest needs. I believe that Christ is the divine child of the living God, and that his grace is like living waters that never be exhausted. I believe in the bathing, refreshing Spirit of God, who yearns over our welfare as a mother yearns for her child. I believe that God is in the arid desert as well as in green pastures, and that hard times and disciplines are also loving gifts. I believe that our journey does have a purpose and a destination, and that our path leads to a final glory we cannot yet imagine. I believe that in the church we are fellow pilgrims on the road, and that we are called to refresh one another as God refreshes us.